Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, the title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, stories of trying to get the rights to expensive global movie franchises, all the little bits and bobs, really, that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of film, the fact that they exist, that it's really difficult to make films, and I'm really glad films are made. Without further ado then, I'm going to start with the first of the two movies I'm covering in this episode of Film Stories, and I'm going back to, the late 2000s for this one. Let me play you a clip, and I'll come to the story the other side of this.
My name is Marcus Wright.
You think you're human?
I am human.
What are you?
I don't know.
I know he's not the enemy.
If we stay the course, we are dead! We are all dead!
I'm the only hope you have.
That then was a clip from 2009's Terminator Salvation, a film directed by McG, written by John Brancato and Michael Ferris, and starring Christian Bale, Sam Worthington, Anton Yelchin, Moon Bloodgood, Bryce Dallas Howard, Common, Jane Alexander, and Helena Bonham Carter. And the story of the fourth Terminator movie began realistically when it was wrapped up with the third. That the rights for Terminator films have been notably prickly over the years, but Carolco Pictures, headed up by Mario Casa and Andrew Vajda, had picked up the rights and successfully made Terminator 2 Judgment Day with James Cameron and Arnold Schwarzenegger in 1991. But Carolco then found itself in a fair amount of trouble, leading to the ultimate bankruptcy of the company as the 1990s went on, and that left the rights to Terminator 3 in limbo. In then came C2 Pictures, formed by Casa and Vajda, and they picked up the rights to make Terminator 3. It would ultimately be Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines, but with an idea of doing Terminator 4 following that pretty much immediately. Not filmed back to back, Back to the Future 2 and 3 style, but one film to fairly quickly follow the other. It had cost them $8 million to get those rights back, and the resultant film, Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines, would come out in 2003. It would star Arnold Schwarzenegger. James Cameron wouldn't be involved. Jonathan Mostow stepped in to direct that one in the end, working with writers John Brancato and Michael Ferris. And the idea was that the characters from the third film would carry over into the fourth film. However, then there was a further disagreement between Mario Casa and Andrew Vajda, and not for the first time time, they were heading off in their separate directions, and this left C2 Pictures in limbo, and this once again left the rights to the Terminator films in limbo. And so let's move on to, we move on to what, 2006, 2007. And in fact, as late as 2006, the plan for a Terminator 4 to follow on from the Terminator 3 that we'd seen still seemed active. But it changed with really a meeting that took place in 2006 between two producers, Derek Anderson and Victor Kubitschek. Now, as reported in the Los Angeles Times, this was a really odd meeting because these two producers, with all due respect to them, didn't have a massive pedigree to them. In fact, they produced one film. It wasn't out yet. It was a 2007 movie called Cook-Off. And I'll leave you now a second just to look that up. Yeah, exactly. It didn't get a theatrical release. It got no profile at all. And yet, these two found themselves in a position through their contacts book of being taken out for lunch at an Italian cafe called Il Pucciolino in West Hollywood in the autumn of 2006. And they were presented with the opportunity to buy the Terminator series. This, as the Los Angeles Times noted, was even though their entire producing experience consisted of one low-budget comedy that never in the end made it into cinemas. It was a remarkable story, this, not least because, as we'll see further down the line, future Terminator rights would involve big bidding wars and auctions and such like. Here, the rights to Terminator 4 were sold on the quiet while no one was really looking. And so they took the deal. They couldn't believe their luck. They snapped it up. They used loans from investment companies. I'll come to that shortly as well. Now, also in the mix in 2006 was MGM. Now, the studio had believed it had inked a deal that at least gave it an exclusive option on distribution rights for the fourth film, that it would have a period of time to decide whether to bid once the package was put to the studio. And so that had been agreed by the previous rights holders. But now we were working with Halcyon. A different bunch of people held the Terminator rights, and the project was moving forward again. But also the project was moving forward not from a standing start, because the development work had been ongoing for a couple of years. That John Brancato and Michael Ferris had started developing Terminator 4 in conjunction with the director of Terminator 3, Jonathan Mostow. They knew at this stage that Arnold Schwarzenegger's involvement was unlikely. He had taken his jump into politics at this point. He was the governor of California, and the assumption was he'd play no part in a fourth Terminator movie, save for perhaps a cameo, if that could be sorted. And so Halcyon Pictures, using a hedge fund loan, moved ahead and decided it was going to press ahead with this. The deal was announced publicly in 2007 with a view of the movie's going to be in cinemas in 2009. That's how quickly they were able to turn this around. Now, there was a slight delay with that MGM deal, which resulted in things heading towards legal shenanigans. The MGM had bought this 30-day period where it had exclusive rights to negotiate distribution for whatever Terminator 4 turned out to be, and there was a disagreement over just what that 30 days entailed. And in the end, to unlock a potentially lengthy court saga, it took an out-of-court settlement and an agreement that MGM would get first refusal on whatever Terminator 5 looked like, and the distribution rights in particular to that. It should be noted that MGM did not take up the rights to Terminator 5, but that is a whole other story. So Halcyon was then looking for studio distributors, because this was an independent movie. It didn't have a studio infrastructure. It didn't have the tools and the mechanism by which to distribute the film. And so it approached a couple of studios and split the global rights to Terminator Salvation. And so the theatrical rights in America went to Warner Brothers, who paid $60 million for the privilege. Sony then stumped up another $100 million to cover the rights absolutely everywhere else on the planet. But the problem that Halcyon was facing was the budget was coming in at $200 million for this. It was, and still is actually, the most expensive Terminator film to date, as I understand it. And it needed to be a really big hit for everyone to get their share. Now, we're now in, late 2007, and the plan, cinema was changing at this point, and the idea of doing a direct follow-on to Terminator 3 was looking a bit shaky, really. Not least, you didn't have Schwarzenegger, and the characters had moved on a little bit. But also, two films had come into the mix that had shown the cinematic world, shown Hollywood, how to do a reboot. 2005's Batman Begins under the stewardship of Christopher Nolan and starring Christian Bale. And then 2006's Casino Royale starring Daniel Craig, directed by Martin Campbell. Now, the former completely revamped the Batman franchise on the big screen as we know it. The latter completely revamped the James Bond franchise as we know it. And it seemed like this was a good opportunity to do something similar for the world of the Terminator. And here's a plan. Could use it to set up a whole new trilogy of Terminator movies. No one would ever have that idea ever again. Splutter. And so the idea for what was being called Terminator Salvation was, at this stage, it would follow the character of John Connor, a pivotal character right throughout the franchise, who would now be in his 30s. It would start a story in the world around him. 3 films would be planned. And alongside this, a television series was bubbling up. It had gone to pilot. It was called the Sarah Connor Chronicles, and that would get a full season order in the end. In fact, it would run for a couple of seasons and would generally be regarded as the best Terminator screen work since the second movie, and I think that's ongoing as well, really. That notwithstanding, Terminator was back clearly with a vengeance. It's going to be a new film, it's going to be a TV series. And so this script was going through quite a lot of rewrite work, and a bunch of writers would come in, even though John Brancato and Michael Ferris were ultimately credited. Oscar winner Paul Haggis came in and took a look at it. Sean Ryan did some work before he returned to his television commitments. And then it was Jonathan Nolan, and there's a link to the Batman franchise for you, who would come in and do further work on the film. And he would also be on set during the production of the movie, continuing to do rewrite work. And in fact, the ultimate director of the film, McG, coming to him in a second, would credit Jonathan Nolan with being like the driving force really behind the script in the end. Now, it's worth noting that against the backdrop of the script being worked on, there was a Writers Guild of America strike, which meant screenwriters for a period of time weren't allowed to work on Hollywood productions. That was in 2007, 2008, and that affected the writing period for the film that would become Terminator Salvation. Its original title, in fact, was Terminator Salvation: The Future Begins. By the time we got to the eventual film, The Future Begins would be gone, and it would just be Terminator Salvation. The rumour that McG was coming in to direct sprung up in October 2007, and I remember a long gone UK film magazine called Film Star described McG as the choice to direct Terminator Salvation as, quote, nobody's first choice. He wasn't a logical fit, just on paper, for the Terminator saga. His biggest hits on the big screen have been the revival of Charlie's Angels, with Charlie's Angels and its follow-up, Charlie's Angels Full Throttle. And there was a perception that he was a filmmaker about style, far, far, far over substance. Could he really bring a darker Terminator film to the screen? He didn't seem a natural fit. That notwithstanding, he did have grounding in television and darker work there, but he wasn't the obvious frontrunner. That said, within a few weeks of the rumour springing up, McG had signed on the dotted line. He had the inevitable reservations about doing this. Who wants to go and follow in the footsteps of James Cameron, the director of the writer and director of the first 2 Terminator films? The first Terminator regarded as a modern science fiction classic. The second one as really just how to do a sequel, just a complete textbook on how to do that. And whilst Jonathan Mostow had achieved some success with Terminator 3, I've covered it in a previous episode of this podcast, there was still the feeling that you were just being compared to the 2 films that kick-started this particular franchise. And did you really want to be the one who goes into it and makes a not very good film? There was a real fear of that. So McG decided to go and see James Cameron, the father of the franchise, really. And Cameron, at this stage, was deep in production on a film called Avatar. Remember that? And so they had a conversation, and McG explained all of this in a long interview he did with MTV around the time. And he said that Cameron quizzed him on why he felt this particular story was worth telling now. But also he had some kind of kinship with McG on this, because he would tell him the tale of how Cameron would tell him the tale of how he had to follow Ridley Scott on Alien when he was making Aliens. You're following in the footsteps of both an iconic science fiction film and a very high profile filmmaker. And so there were reports after this meeting that Cameron had explicitly given Terminator 4 his blessing, but actually that proved not to be the case. He would turn out to be far more positive in the press, ironically, about the next two Terminator films that came around. But as McGee explained, Cameron had just reserved the right to like the movie or not like the movie as any other movie fan. And the words that were reported by MTV were Cameron saying, "Hey man, I'd rather you guys made a good movie than a bad movie, but I'm not going to sit there and top thump for you guys and tell the world how excited I am about this new idea." But they shook hands, it was a friendly meeting, and McGee went away and started putting together the work needed to bring Terminator Salvation to the screen. Casting wise, an offer went out to Christian Bale. Of course, the link to Batman Begins is writ there. Went out 3 times, in fact, before he would ultimately accept the movie on the 4th occasion. He took a meeting with McGee and took some persuading, really, because he had the same reservations as anyone. Why would you step into the Terminator franchise? You're just on a bit of a hiding to nothing. Now, Bale would ultimately explain many years afterwards that he begrudgingly, his word, took the role. And the reason he would explain to MTV as to why he took it was, well, a little bit of a contrarian, really. Bale would say, "There's a perverse side to me where people were telling me there's no way on God's earth I should take that role." And I was thinking the same thing. But then he said, when people started verbalising that to me, I started to go, "Oh, really? All right, well, watch this then." And so Bale would admit there was a little bit of that involved in the choice, and he would sign up to make Terminator Salvation. But he was originally offered the role of Marcus in the movie. Now, Marcus was ultimately played by Sam Worthington in the film, but Bale was far more drawn to the idea of playing John Connor. So John Connor in the script at this stage was effectively a supporting part, but when you've got Christian Bale coming on board, then this is Christian Bale who's just wrapped filming on The Dark Knight, and he's hoping that would be a hit, and clearly brings with it a lot of profile as an actor. Well, the role was beefed up and rewritten, and Jonathan Nolan was pivotal to that, as I understand it, the power of Batman there. Now, the writing was interrupted by that writer's strike, but the casting certainly wasn't. Sam Worthington, who was, ironically enough, working with James Cameron on Avatar, would join the cast in February 2008, and they'd exchange 1 or 2 friendly words about that. The late, brilliant Anton Yelchin would sign up. Tilda Swinton had been set to join the film in the end, but fairly late in the day, Helena Bonham Carter would take the role that she was earmarked for, and it was ready to go. May the 5th, 2008 was going to be the day that the first shots were called. A lot of location and studio filming on this, as you would expect, a real mix of the two. But McGee went into the production of Terminator Salvation, wanted it to be as physical as possible. That he didn't want this to be a CG fest. He knew that there were going to have to be computer graphics in it and visual effects, but he also knew and he was a fan of the Terminator franchise, and he knew what it was built on. And so he went to Stan Winston, the legendary monster and creature creator who had built the robots and the machines in the earlier films, and hired Winston to do similar work on Terminator Salvation. Now, Winston would pass away while the film was being made, and the resultant movie remains dedicated to him. But one of the reasons he brought Winston in wasn't just that he absolutely loved his work. He felt it would help the actors as well. That I think it's pretty well known that when you've got a CG creature in a movie, actors are given something, a reference, a tennis ball or something, just so they can get their eye line, something to look at. But McGee wanted them to be looking at great bloody robots trying to kill them. You know, he wanted them to see what they were up against and to see that glistening red light that's kind of iconic really to the Terminator films. And so he was really keen that they were able to do that, and they were able to do that. They had the budget, and there was a growing feeling that Terminator 4 could be really something. This was a franchise that was going to be on an upward curve after this one, after the slight bump of Terminator 3. It was also playing close to Terminator mythos as well. As much as this was another story within the Terminator world, it wasn't going to be entirely independent of the first 2 films. That they kept referencing the first 2 movies on set. They wanted this to work for fans. They wanted to weave in little references and bits and bobs. And so they did so. And in the midst of it all, it was a really tough shoot. That Christian Bale, for instance, broke his hand while making the film. There's a load of stunt work on this. Sam Worthington injured his back. The physicality of it was coming with a lot of bumps and bruises, but McGee kept pushing for it. There was an insinuation that came out that McGee and Bale didn't, in the end, exactly see eye to eye. And there was an incident during the shoot, and I suspect most of you know what it is, which I'll come to in a second, which wouldn't exactly calm the waters. There was still a mystery as to whether Arnold Schwarzenegger would find space in his busy schedule to film a cameo. And also there was kind of a political consideration there. If you've been elected as an official, do you want to take a day out of your schedule to go and make a movie? It's like, which job did you want? And he was reportedly quite conscious of the political choice he had to make there. As it would turn out, Schwarzenegger would really late, actually, in post-production, give permission for an appearance in the movie, but he wouldn't film it, that it would be a digital recreation of his T-800, and that's the only time his face is seen in the film. But shooting wrapped up on July the 20th, 2008, and it's fairly brief. It was under 3 months, really, the physical shoot of this, but of course there was a lot of CG work still to be done. And the build-up to the release of the film, I mean, they went through Comic-Cons, McG did interviews with all sorts of outlets, they showed footage of this, and they were really looking to pump up and hype excitement for a new Terminator film and re-energise this franchise. But the news cycle would be overtaken by a leak of a moment on set that during that summer 2008 shoot, and it took some time before this footage came out, there was a moment where Christian Bale infamously lost his temper at cinematographer Shane Hulbert. Now, Shane Hulbert had walked in a shot that they were in the midst of doing. And I think it would be fair to say that Christian Bale was not massively impressed, to the point where he had a rant. That rant was being filmed at the time. They were on a film set. And after the production of the film had wrapped up, it leaked online and went absolutely all around the world and became the dominant story surrounding Terminator Salvation for some time. There were other stories, though, just doing battle during post-production as well. So, for instance, news landed that Linda Hamilton, Sarah Connor in the first two films, would potentially be back for a role. And in the end, she confirmed as much to MTV that it was under consideration. As it would turn out, it'd be her voice that would be used rather than her appearing on screen. But the other debate that was raging was considerable concern over Salvation arriving in cinemas with a PG-13/12A rating. That every Terminator film, to date in the US, had gone out with an R rating. These films were not aimed at children, but this was a case where, for the first time, it was PG-13. It was going to be available to a family audience. And the trail had been blazed really a little bit by Batman Begins, which had pushed the hard edges of PG-13, as had The Dark Knight in 2008. And so when it became clear that Terminator Salvation was going to appear with that rating as well, then at least there was a line of defence. Now, McG would insist that this was organic, that the two parent studios, Warner Brothers and Sony, were cool either way. If it's R-rated in the States, it's R-rated. If it's PG-13, it's PG-13. And as McG explained to MTV in an interview, he said, from day one, we were given the okay to shoot the movie we wanted to shoot. We talked to everyone and they said, if it's an R, it's an R. We're just going to make the movie we want to make. And McG said it became clear that the things that would take it to an R or a PG or an NC-17, which is the most restrictive rating in the US, would be things like, oh, there goes an arm and now the blood is squirting on my face. And McG would argue that wasn't in the service of the characters or the story. And ultimately, we were able to make exactly the film we wanted to make without any compromise whatsoever. And it just so happened to garner the rating it got. Now, I've done some searching. He doesn't seem to have done an interview since to contradict that. So I take that on face value. After then, an extensive period of promotion and the tour of the Comic-Cons and the fan sites and such like, Terminator Salvation debuted in cinemas on the Thursday, May the 21st, 2009 in the US. It made it into cinemas with the reviews, let's just say, not on the positive side. In fact, there was quite a critical backlash against this one. There were very few people who were going out of their way to really give it a positive write, although there were a few, but generally there was a feeling that after Terminator 3, this wasn't the upgrade that people were necessarily hoping for. So it blasted onto screens the weekend of, it's Memorial Day weekend in the US. So that ran May the 22nd to the 25th, and it opened in second place. It didn't manage to snag first with a slightly underwhelming $51.9 million across a 4-day weekend. It displaced Star Trek, the reboot of that, which had been doing good business for Paramount. That was in third place. But the number one film that week, and it was a new opener, Night at the Museum, Battle of the Smithsonian, Germany and opened with $70 million for Fox. And that was the successful one. It was a cheaper film to make. It was making more money. The other films that were around, well, Dance Flick opened that weekend as well. But the competition was Angels and Demons, starring Tom Hanks, X-Men Origins, Wolverine was in there, Leaning Matthew McConaughey in Ghosts of Girlfriends Past, Monsters vs. Aliens 17 again. And it was films of that ilk. And then the week after, even more competition came along because Pixar's Up managed to seize the top spot with 68 million. Terminator Salvation lost, about 60% of its business after its first week. Sam Raimi's Drag Me to Hell opened with 15 million the second week it was out in cinemas. And the film just kind of then started to fall, that it hung around the box office charts for a while, and no one would call it an abject flop, but its US gross of $125 million was not the high point in the franchise that the backers of the film were hoping for. Now, the Terminator franchise does mean, though, that the film will travel, and this is why you pay so much for the rights. Nearly $250,000 came in outside of America, and the worldwide take was $371 million. Not too shabby, apart from the fact that they'd spent $200 million to make it in the first place, and so it was going to take a long time for Halcyon and its investors to get a return on that money. Against the backdrop of the box office rolling in, even though there was an acceptance it wasn't as high as wanted, there was still talk of the fifth film carrying on straight afterwards, that McG had toyed with doing a darker ending to the fourth one, but he said in an interview in August 2009, so a few months after the release of the film, he was still on board for Terminator 5, and he would admit, he said, I think the film missed some of the fun that Jim Cameron brought to the early pictures. There was also a question as whether the Sarah Connor Chronicles TV show had taken some of the glare away, that people were more watching Terminator on the small screen than the big. But McG, in interviews at the time, was saying he was keen to do the fifth one. He told IGN that he had a commitment to make 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea first, which ultimately wouldn't happen. But in terms of Terminator 5, he said, we're working on it right now. We're very far down the line with the story for that, for the next picture, and even the picture after that. I'm feeling good, and we'll see where that takes us. And the plan was to take Terminator off into time travel, so they weren't consistently focusing the films on Oblivion and the end of the world, and just trying to put something a little bit light in there. So there was development work going. McG was looking to return, but he just wouldn't get the chance. That Halcyon had gambled its house on Salvation, and there was no two ways about it. The returns had come up way short, and by the end of 2009, at less than 6 months after the release of Salvation, Halcyon filed for bankruptcy, and the rights for the Terminator would be back up for auction again. And in fact, they wouldn't be snapped up in it is a much higher profile auction until 2012, when Annapurna Pictures would pick them up. And Annapurna, rather than continuing the Salvation story, thought, I know, let's do a new Terminator trilogy. And then when their Terminator film didn't take off, back came James Cameron for Terminator Dark Fate, and the idea was, I know, let's do another Terminator trilogy. Interestingly, in 2015, Arnold Schwarzenegger expressed relief he wasn't properly in Salvation, declaring in an interview with Good Morning America that, quote, it sucked. I'll just leave this line here. He was promoting Terminator Genesis at the time. But more recently, in 2020, McG has brought the film up again, not least in the aftermath of Justice League and the fan campaign for Zack Snyder's cut of the Justice League movie that was ultimately successful. And talking to CBR, McG said, it's interesting because I feel like we did so much right with Terminator, but ultimately got just enough wrong that we got beat up a little by the fan base, and it really, really broke my heart. And he says, now, strangely, I think the film has started to age better, and there is a different cut, he confirmed. He said, I have my own cut of that film. There's people online that talk about wanting to see that cut, and that's interesting, but I think I got a lot of things right with that. And I would suggest it's true that the reputation of Terminator Salvation has grown since its release in 2009, not least because we've had two further attempts to launch a Terminator trilogy, one of which I would suggest is legitimately terrible. And Salvation, there's a groundswell of opinion. Quite how big it is, I couldn't tell you, but there's a groundswell of opinion that suggests it is the best Terminator film outside of the first two. Christian Bale probably doesn't agree, though. When he's talked about it, he described it in an interview with MTV as a film that's, quote, a great thorn in my side. And he expressed regret. He said, I wish we could have reinvigorated the franchise. And unfortunately, during production, you could tell that wasn't happening. It's a great shame. It would be a story that would repeat itself a couple of times. And at the point this podcast is being recorded, not for the first time in its history, the Terminator franchise finds itself in limbo with no clear direction for which way the next film will go. Salvation at least had a direction. There were 2 unmade films that would follow it. Never got to see them. Salvation, though, might just be worth giving it another look. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. And as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. I'm just going to do a couple of parish notices before we move on to the second of the 2 films I'm going to talk about. Firstly, if you like this podcast, and thank you everyone who does, I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. There are 3 ways you can support it. If you go to patreon.com/Simon Brew and put a few pounds in the pot there, that money's used for a couple of things. Number 1, I pay upcoming writers to pen articles for our website. One of the key things behind the Film Stories project is giving people an opportunity, giving them a paid break and a way into writing about film. It's also used to procure resources that I use for the research as part and parcel of this podcast as well. What you get in return is you get the podcast early pretty much every week. You get some extras as well. So for instance, I've just recently done a live show in Birmingham. The audio of that is going on the Patreon shortly, and you find out the gossip of what we're up to early as well. There's quite a few things that we're working on that I think Patreons are already aware of. If you could subscribe to this podcast, that helps enormously as well. And just to round off the how to beat the algorithms, if you could leave ideally a hugely positive review. It's the same for any independent podcast, really. Stuff like that really helps us bubble up and get noticed. And I can't tell you how much it's appreciated. Finally, in the parish notices, I have a new issue of Film Stories magazine that is now shipping. I'm looking at copies of it. You can find that at store.filmstories.co.uk. A big interview with Mark Kermode and Simon Mayo about their move from the BBC to their brand new podcast. That leads the issue. There's a whole lot more in there as well. But without further ado, that's enough parish notices, because I'm going to move on to the second film I'm talking about in this episode of the podcast. Let's just say it's a slight change of tone. Going to 1991, going to play you a clip from the trailer, and I'll come to the story of this one, The Other Side of This.
Oh dear.
Now, a new king must be found.
Excuse me, Sir Cedric.
Yes?
I do believe we found an heir.
Is he everything we might have hoped?
Allow me to introduce our sovereign lord, Ralph Jones, King of Great Britain, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith.
John Goodman
Is everybody having a good time?
is King Ralph.
Good golly, Miss Molly.
Where did they find this man? John Goodman. Peter O'Toole. He's uncouth. He's unkempt. He's the king. King Ralph.
That then, well, they've given it away for me, really. It's a clip from 1991's comedy King Ralph, directed by David S. Ward. He wrote the screenplay as well, based on the novel Headlong by Emlyn Williams. The cast led by John Goodman, Peter O'Toole, John Hurt, in fact, half of Britain, really. Camille Kaduri's in there, Anne Beach, Richard Griffith, Leslie Phillips, Jolie Richardson. It's quite a long cast list for this one. And, well, the story effectively starts for this one in 1980 when Emlyn Williams published the novel Headlong, although really it probably goes back a few years before that as well to the filmmaker David S. Ward, who by this stage was an Oscar winner. He'd penned the screenplay for the film The Sting, which won Best Picture, but also got him an Academy Award for his writing. And he would branch into directing in the end with 1983's pretty forgotten sequel, The Sting 2. But it was his second film as director that really lifted him up in Hollywood eyes, just as a commercial success. And that was the film Major League, which came out, in 1989. It earned him some commercial cachet, really. And that meant he had some currency to get another project or two moving. And so the one that came across his desk was King Ralph, a film about the British royal family and, let's just say, a bit of a clash of culture. It's a project that had the late Sidney Pollack involved in its development as well. And if you're unfamiliar with the movie, it tells the story of an accident that wipes out most of the royal family to the point here in the UK, to the point where they look for the next person who's in line with for the throne. They go right down the list and they find an American man, a bit of a slobbish American man by the name of Ralph. And so the story goes that when this started to move towards being developed as a film and the script being put together, it was seen as a starring vehicle for Bill Murray. And this was Bill Murray, who had just returned to movies after several years away with the films Scrooged and Ghostbusters 2. But again, Murray was reported to have turned this one down. And so a couple of other names came onto the radar. John Candy was one that was mooted, but he was committed to making Dan Aykroyd's directorial debut, Nothing But Trouble. And on the small screen in the TV show Roseanne, John Goodman was earning a lot of success. He'd made the jump to films. He'd appeared in Sea of Love, 1990s Arachnophobia. I've covered that before as well. Worked with the Coen brothers too. But he was still more famous for his work on television. But nonetheless, it was in January of 1990 that the news came through that Goodman was to take the title role in the film King Ralph. It was going to be a big breakthrough leading man role for Goodman. The first time he headlined a film, although he would downplay this quite a lot, I'll come to it again shortly, and insisted he was still a character actor. Also in January of 1990 came the confirmation that Ward would be directing his screenplay and that the project was coming together at speed. In fact, shooting was just a few months away. So Ward gave an interview to the New York Times where he talked about this, and in particular it drew on what attracted him in the first place. And he described his desire to write, quote, British humour, which he described as, quote, drawing room comedy, dry sardonic wit, repartee and understated sarcasm, which ironically reads as my curriculum vitae. He said that he'd been a fan of watching the works of Noel Coward, of Alan Bennett, quote, the sophisticated and satirical comedies made at the Ealing Studios in West London during the late 40s and early 50s, and also hit British TV shows at the time, Yes Minister and Blackadder. And these were that kind of tone, that kind of touch point were the kind of things that were in David S. Ward's brain when he was tackling the King Ralph project. So he had the budget, he had a script, he got the green light to go on it, but there were still hurdles before they could start filming this, because Ward knew that this was a story of British royalty and thus it needed to be filmed in Britain, and there had to be some careful treading around the establishment here in the UK, in particular the British royal family, because after all the plot of the film is pretty brutal. A freak photography accident right at the start. This is not a spoiler, I'd suggest, because it's right up there in the trailer, taking out many members of the royal family in one go. And so apparently the script was thus sent to representatives of the royal family so that they could cast their eye over it. And whilst there's nothing firmly on record, there does seem to be an implication that they were not terribly amused by it. And a couple of requests came back to the filmmakers off the back of them sending the script in for approval. So one of them was that the surname Windsor should not be used at any point during the film. And so the royal family that we see in the film King Ralph goes with the surname Wyndham. A further official request was forthcoming. There were to be no lookalikes of either Prince Charles or Princess Diana used in the movie. And then when royal advisors read the scene of the opening sequence of mass electrocution of the lineage to the British throne, there was a request from the palace that no children were to appear in that scene. And again, that was a request that the filmmakers ceded to. So David S. Ward went to great lengths talking to the New York Times. He said it's not the real Windsor family. He said it would have been a bit of a grisly note to have the actual Windsors killed off in the first 5 minutes of the film, then with their children and all. That is not funny. That was not the tone of the film he was going for. He was trying to make a light comedy, and in fact the plot point of getting lots of the royal family out the way is deliberately dealt with very quickly in the movie. Get through that bit fast and you can get onto the comedy of it. Permission was neither sought nor was it thus given for the film to shoot in and around Buckingham Palace and parts of the royal estate. But what that meant was the film came to the UK and used a whole host of stately homes and posh exteriors from around the country that were used to double for royal buildings that we see in the movie. The only American in the cast was going to be John Goodman as well, and David S. Ward was very careful to cast a lot of British actors, and a real coup to get Peter O'Toole in this one as well, John Hurt, of course, Leslie Phillips. And they had this 20 million budget in place. Universal Pictures was picking up the tab, and with everything in place, the film could press ahead, and filming duly began at Pinewood Studios in the UK on the 17th of April 1990. Now, it was not commonplace for American productions to shoot in the UK at this point. It's very commonplace at the point this podcast has been recorded in 2022. We've had, a decade or more of tax breaks and all sorts of incentives put in for Hollywood to come and shoot in the UK. All sorts of studio complexes spring up. This was a rarity. The UK film industry was pretty much on its knees in 1990. It was struggling to get films of its own off the ground, and to have an American studio movie shooting in the UK was a bit of a boon. And filming took place around the country as well. So one of the locations you see in the movie was Highclere Castle, which might now be more familiar to fans of Downton Abbey and its spin-off movies. The production went to London, it went to Yorkshire, it went right near where I live now in Hagley as well, in the West Midlands. And so they also recreated the House of Lords on stages at Pinewood Studios as well, a nice parliamentary set there. But they were conscious when they were doing all of this, the whole thing had to look the business, that Simon Holland was the production designer on the movie, and they were making a royal film. As much as they were putting a comedy in the midst of all of this, the royalty aspect of it had to stack up. And as Holland would explain to the New York Times, he said, when people think of royalty, they think that everything's fairly glitzy, so we had to make it that way. And so they had a workshop where they were coming up with all sorts of very posh furniture that would then be taken around the different houses they shot in around the UK as well. They had resin busts made of John Goodman that were then made into King Ralph's souvenir dolls for the film, apparently. But as Holland would explain, one aims for a sort of grandeur and elegance. It's a fairy tale, so because of that, you exaggerate. The other area where they were really spending money just to get the scale of it across as well was extras. That I often think that the best special effect you'll ever see in a film is a human being. And King Ralph has sequences where up to 400 extras were used in the shooting of moments for the movie. Now, Goodman, it was his debut leading man role, but he was playing that down. He would give an interview to the Los Angeles Times about this, and he said, the only difference for me this time was I didn't have time to fool around when I wasn't working. That was the distinction for him between being the character actor or the supporting actor and being the first name on the call sheet. He says, when you're the leading man, your meter's running all the time and you're always working. There's no goof-off time. But he did add, no one's ready to call me Mel Gibson Jr. That might be a relief. And I don't think anybody's ready to pay good money to see me get the girl in the movie, and he included himself in that. Now, Goodman did have the opportunity to flex his musical skills on the shoot of this one, because the other difference to his other roles was he was being leaned on for musical numbers in the movie, and he attacked these with gusto. That there are a couple of moments in the film where we see the character King Ralph singing along, and it is very much Goodman's performance you get there. There's no doubling for his voice. That was him on set, absolutely going great guns. Tone right throughout the shoot was really important to Ward on this one, and he was really concerned, and he would explain this in interviews, that King Ralph should be funny, but not merely in a straightforward performance-oriented American way, but also in a wry, verbal British way. And he described one of the key things to him was the opportunity to contrast British and American comedy, and how that was what appealed to him about the making of the film. Now, production would wrap up on King Ralph on the 13th of July 1990. And how about this? It's shot, by my calculation, for slightly longer than Terminator Salvation. There you go. That's one for a pub quiz. If it ever comes up in a pub quiz, I want the prize, but there we go. Now, in post-production, there were still some changes. This is a film that had a reshoot done to it as well. News broke in December 1990 that the filmmakers or the studio, it was not entirely clear which, weren't entirely happy with the ending of the movie that had originally been shot, and thus the cast and crew were reassembled for reshoots at the end of 1990. Now, it's worth noting these were really, really late in the day, that we're in the era where movies were distributed on film in canisters that were shunted around the country, and as such couldn't be delivered to cinemas fairly quickly on DCPs or via digital services, and thus distribution of the movie would take up a couple of weeks before its release date. It was only 6 weeks before the release that these reshoots were taking place, and the film duly got its premiere with those reshoots done on February the 11th 1991 in Los Angeles, with a wider theatrical release in America on February the 15th. But before I get to that release, it's worth looking at the way that this film was marketed, because they came up with one or two clever little bits and bobs here that really helped get the film a bit of box office attention. So a Variety report back from 1991 revealed that the studio in the US was sending gifts to 2,000 members of the press through the post. Now, this is not an unusual practice. Studios often send freebies to journalists. It happens to this day. You might see them tweeted an awful lot. But it wasn't the fact that they were sending the gifts. It was the fact that each of those 2,000 members of the press got 5 different mailings through the post in the end. Now, David Samuth at that time was Universal's Senior Vice President of Marketing and Creative Advertising, and he described it, the challenge they faced was the trick was to find a way to tell the joke correctly. And in this case, the film, he said, the joke is built into his name and the title. It's a strong concept, and it's a high concept as well. Universal had released the film Twins, for instance, which could be sold with the simple line, Schwarzenegger, DeVito, twins, which is how they sold it. In the case of King Ralph, they knew very early on what the poster was going to be. You were going to have John Goodman slobbing out on the throne, and that was going to be the image. This is the King of England, and he's there having a burger and just putting his feet where they shouldn't go. So the poster almost looked after itself in the end. They got the concept early and executed that. The 5 mailings that were sent out to the press, well, first of all, Universal Pictures sent a palace invitation to the coronation of King Ralph, complete with a photo of Goodman in blue jeans wearing the robe and crown. And there was a microchip melody of Hail Britannia that played when journalists opened up their post as well. Next, they got a trio of King Ralph commemorative stamps. They got a Pimplex Royal Family Guide written by Lady Marmoset Catatonia Anthrax. And then they got an In Ralph We Trust commemorative coin and plate that they were getting royal memorabilia with John Goodman's mush splattered all over it. Separately to that, Universal's marketing team jumped on John Goodman singing the song Good Golly Miss Molly in King Ralph, and it got the video of that on MTV, then fairly nascent, of course, but it was in hard rotation on MTV, and there was John Goodman front and centre, very, very present in the media at that point, and the name of King Ralph just kept coming up and up and up and up. Universal took no chances on the press junket as well. It's got sent all the press out to New Orleans, all expenses paid. But then it could mitigate some of the cost of that with an unlikely, perhaps, tie-in with Burger King. Now, we think of Burger King now and its tie-ins with big action movies and blockbusters and things like that. Burger King stumped up a reported $8 million for a promotion that ran for 4 weeks that was based around the image of Ralph, John Goodman's Ralph, slobbing down on a Whopper. Basically, there's a sentence. Never thought I'd say that. So the general consensus at this stage was the promotional campaign was terrific. It was really going great guns and it was selling hard. The concept, more than the film perhaps, but the concept of it was coming across. The downside was when the film actually got in front of critics, I mean, it just got the boot. That there was, Goodman came in for praise, but the film itself was regarded as fairly thin. There weren't that many jokes in it. It was reliant on personalities and just not a good film. That was generally the consensus of that. Nonetheless, the marketing had done its job, that the movie found its way into cinemas. And remember, this was $20 million, although it spent quite a lot of money, Universal did, on the promotion of it. Found its way into cinemas the weekend of February the 22nd to the 24th, and it opened in a healthy position at the US box office. That its opening was $8.327 million on the President's Day long weekend. It was in third place. It was up against The Silence of the Lambs that had been playing, and that had opened to a strong 13 million. Sleeping with the Enemy with Julia Roberts was in there. Home Alone was hanging over from Christmas, as was Dances with Wolves. LA Story was about as well, and there was Nothing But Trouble with John Candy and Dan Aykroyd far down the chart with 3.9 million as its opening weekend. And King Ralph hung around for a little bit. It was never going to be a massive juggernaut of a hit, but it sat in the top 10 for long enough for Universal to be pretty content. And in fact, by the time it left US cinemas, it had grossed $34 million. And I think there was a sense of that will do. And in fact, it would add another, $18-20 million overseas. A $52 million haul for a comedy that wasn't particularly funny, that was selling hard around a single concept. But There were two further things to do with this film. This is probably my favourite because when it comes to the UK, if you're unfamiliar with some of the pageantry here in the UK, each year there is a royal performance film that is put on, that members of the royal family attend. People get dolled up to go and see it and make themselves look all glam and posh and stuff like that. And the story was that Universal, sorry, I can't get a second source on this, so I report it in pencil, but it just amused me an awful lot. But the story goes that Universal offered King Ralph as a possible option for the royal performance film. And the idea of like people going to a posh venue with the royal family to watch a film about, well, the first 5 minutes of the film would be quite an interesting watch in that context, I would suggest. The royal family was said to have declined that opportunity. The film that was chosen that year for the royal performance film, beautifully, was Hot Shots, the spoof movie starring Charlie Sheen and Lloyd Bridges. And so instead, everyone just got poshed up to see Lloyd Bridges slide a hanky through his ears. King Ralph, it's not a film with a massive legacy. Sometimes on this podcast we hear stories of, oh, there must be a Broadway musical, or it's a film that found its audience over time, or loads of sequels. No one since has gone out of their way to praise King Ralph. John Hurt would memorably say that it did the movie for the cash. John Goodman would go on, he would follow up with lead role in films such as The Flintstones a few years later, but he would also tend to agree that the movie isn't a great one, but he would mitigate that by saying he enjoyed it because he got to spend time with Peter O'Toole and get tips from what he described, not unreasonably, as a bona fide acting legend. King Ralph is just a bit of an anomaly in 1990 cinema, and particularly early 1990s cinema, that it made its mark, it pretty much disappeared. There's no Criterion Edition Blu-ray of this one, there's no 4K remaster, and when the film came round for its 30th anniversary, there weren't fan screenings of this one. But it was a movie that came together remarkably quickly, that had a fair few stories in and amongst the production of it. But as with the marketing campaign, it might just be one of those where the stories are more interesting than, well, the story. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for your time. If I have not completely bored you, you can hear more of my wittering, or get more of them, on Twitter at Simon Brew. The entire Film Stories project is on Twitter at Film Stories Pod. We have a website, filmstories.co.uk. That is updated every weekday with movie news, with reviews, with features, with an assortment of mayhem, really. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, you can buy how many we got now? 42 different print magazines. Some of them have sold out. Our latest issue is on sale there as well. You will also be able to find our Blu-ray of Sneakers available in the UK with fresh extras that we put together for that. That's store.filmstories.co.uk. If you go to youtube.com/filmstories, we're slowly re-energising that and looking to put one or two more video film stories on there. And we're on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline as well. I will have news of more live events, hopefully in the next episode of the podcast. But for now, I thank you for your time. I thank you for listening. And I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. You all take care. Bye-bye.